Hey, it's Nether. I made another Path of Exile 2 tips video for you. These tips are a bit more advanced than the previous 30 tips video. If you are completely new to Path of Exile, I recommend to give that a watch first. It's linked down below in the description. However, a lot of information should be easy to understand even if you're somewhat new to Path of Exile. I will do my best to explain everything as simple as possible. And hopefully by the end of the video you have learned some new things, whether you're already a veteran or a beginner. Let's dive straight in, starting with tip number 1. You probably already know that you can anoint your amulet with a notable passive skill from the passive skill tree using Distilled Ires, but did you know that you can override your anoint and instill an uncorrupted amulet as many times as you want? So if you put some cheap Ires on your amulet just to get any useful anoint for your build and you decide you want to replace it with something better, you can. If you want to quickly see which Ires you need for the notable you desire, simply press Alt while hovering over the notable on the passive skill tree. Tip number 2. Magic jewels with 2 good modifiers can be extremely expensive thanks to the Adorned jewel, which is an expensive unique jewel that increases the modifiers of corrupted magic jewels by 1 to 100%. Correction, it actually rolls from 0 to 100%, and if you get really unlucky you can have an Adorned jewel with no modifiers on it if it actually rolls 0. The Adorned currently costs about 17 divine orbs for a 50% plus increased roll, which is about the breakpoint where it starts being really strong. Don't just blindly regal and exalt all of your jewels before price checking them. You could accidentally brick a really big ticket item. Running the Adorned and magic jewels could also be inspiration for your build. If you are a wealthy exile, that is. In addition to magic jewels, any magic item with a strong base and 1 or 2 good modifiers could be worth a fortune. This could be rare items too, of course, as long as there is space for mods. Think of a magic breach ring, for example. A piece of gear that has potential to become really good is usually worth a lot more than a mediocre piece with no crafting options available. And now that some more content creators shed light on that knowledge, awareness is being spread and less people are scamming themselves. Nice. Tip number 3. Corrupt your items with Vow Orbs for additional stats. Corrupting items is a lot less risky in Path of Exile 2 as opposed to PoE1. It can be a great idea to buy a backup of your cheapest piece of gear and try to corrupt an implicit modifier or socket on them. The odds are basically a coin flip. Perhaps you're using a cheap unique for your build? You can try to get a nice corruption on it without risking too much. Just make sure that failing your corruption does not brick your build. Always have backup gear readily available when taking risks, especially if you're playing solo self-found. And if you're trying to corrupt an item that is worth at least 1 or 2 divine orbs, always use the Omen of Corruption, which you can buy at the currency exchange for around 100 Exalted orbs and increase your odds of a W corruption. Take note that all prices mentioned in this video may vary. These were the prices a couple of days ago when recording this footage. Exalted orbs are going down in value a lot, as there is actually no real Exalted orb sink in the game. As of January 28th, 2025, a Divine sells for 290 Exalted orbs and a single Chaos orb sells for 7 Exalted orbs. Players are starting to price their items for Chaos orbs instead of Exalted orbs if they're worth less than a Divine, and I highly recommend you do the same. On the contrary of magic jewels, corrupting rare jewels can also be very profitable. It's accessible for most players who are in the endgame to buy a couple 10 to 20 Exalted jewels with mods that work well for their build and corrupt them for some potential power gains. For example, you can roll 5% chaos resistance, 8 to any attribute, 10% of an elemental resistance, etc. Always make sure the item is finalized before corrupting it. Don't forget to add quality, sockets where possible, and make sure there's no space for mods if it's a rare item. It could also be good practice to try and val your crappy jewels in hopes of hitting something nice through quote-unquote bricking them. Tip number 4. Found an item you think is very valuable, but there are no examples on the trade website to compare to, even when searching with less similar modifiers and or lowering the values, it can be very difficult to price these kind of items. My advice is to go a bit overkill with the price and then slowly lower the price over time, and try to look up similar items every time you reprice the item to get a better idea of its value. This is best done using Exiled Exchange, the software I'm using in this example. Tip number 5. This tip ties right in with the previous one. Reprice all of your items for sale periodically. You can either do this with multiple fixed priced stash tabs or hand listing items individually. If you are not selling the item, it will inevitably rot away in your stash. You could be using that currency to make your build stronger and in turn farm more currency more efficiently. Look at it this way, even if you think you are underselling your item, you still have made a sale and gained something from it, where all the other items available are yet to be sold. Tip number 6. Clean your stash and get rid of all those 1 to 3 exalted items that you're not going to sell or use anyways. It will save new players from desperately spam whispering 100 people to finally get a reply, and now they only have to whisper 99. On top of that, it gives you a way better overview of the items you're selling, and you won't lose track of any expensive items for sale. It would be a shame if that 10 divine rare is just rotting away desperately waiting for a repricing session. Tip number 7. If you care about efficiency at all, optimizing your hideout layout is something you might want to do. Put all of your NPCs and interactable objects close together, so you barely have to move in your hideout to save some time. Over tens or even hundreds of hours of mapping, this is going to save you a lot more time than you think. The best trick here is to put your well behind your salvage bench, so you can click it without moving to it.
Breaking news, this just in. YouTuber NetherCookie demands more subscribers. Nether claims to be working his absolute butt off trying to grow as a YouTuber, but the numbers are lacking. As of today, only 2.8% of people that watch his videos are actually subscribed to his channel. He needs your help to bump this number up so he can pursue his passion of content creation. Thank you for your consideration. And while you're at it, you might as well drop a like too.
Yo, this pirate software mic filter is absolutely baller. Okay, back to the video. Tip number 8. Exiled Exchange is a third-party program that allows you to quickly look up items on the trade website in-game. I also covered it in my previous 30 tips video, and we used it earlier to price check our items. If you're using Exiled Exchange, do not sleep on all the hotkeys. You can use a hotkey to invite the player that last messaged you to your party for a trade, another to send a trade request, but most importantly, teleporting to your hideout with a single button, rather than having to go through a waypoint every time. Simply press Shift plus space to open up the Exiled Exchange settings menu, where you can assign all of your preferred hotkeys. Tip number 9. It should not come as news that increased rarity is a busted stat on gear. However, the increased rarity modifier does have diminishing returns. 100 to 150 rarity on your gear is the sweet spot, and you should see about 2-3 times the loot you would get without any increased rarity at all. If you have some currency laying around to tinker with your build, I highly advise trying to squeeze in 100% plus increased rarity on your gear. There are also soul cores you can socket in your gear to increase item rarity by 10%. Which is the soul core of Askapa. Those are a bit expensive at 430 exalt a pop. I remember buying them for 150 exalt, I don't know what happened. Tip number 10. If you don't meet the attribute requirements for a piece of gear, but that piece of gear gives you sufficient additional attributes to wear it, you can respec your passive tree to meet the requirements, equip the piece of gear, and then respec the attributes back. Just make sure to not unequip that piece of gear, as it would require you to go through the respecking process once more. I use this technique to equip dex strength based boots that give me plus 30 dexterity, where I spec the extra dex to equip them and then change it back to strength. Tip number 11. You can add many different stats to your gear using soul cores. And now that we can replace socketed runes and soul cores, even on corrupted gear, there should be no fear to try out new things. A very good and popular soul core is the soul core of Taktaki, which gives 7% increased chaos resistance, and is very affordable. When you get into the later stages of the endgame, and you've farmed up the currency to buy gear pieces that give you a juicy chaos resistance roll on their own to cap out your chaos rest, it opens up options for other soul cores to be used. For example, there's one for each elemental resistance that gives maximum resistance. Increased max resistance is one of the best defensive stats in the game. With max resistance, you can actually go beyond the cap of 75% resistance and get all the way to 90% resistance. This is also the case for block, by the way. The soul core that gives 2% increased maximum life is amazing for life-based builds. Just have a good look at all the options before deciding what to put in your sockets. Tip number 12. A very good and affordable endgame unique is Warrior Invictus Grand Regalia, which, when corrupted, can have up to 5 sockets. This unique body armor increases specific stats per socketed rune or soul core. I recently made the switch to run this chest piece on my warrior, and it's a massive boost in survivability. Not only that, with 5 sockets filled, I gain 50% all elemental resistance on top of 25% increased max life. The massive resistance stats open up a lot of options for modifiers on my other pieces of gear, such as Rarity. Most uncorrupted 4-socket warriors cost about 1 divine orb. Some are a bit more expensive, in particular the mod that increases attributes. I socketed my chest with 1% max cold rest soul cores. The attribute requirements of 51 int and 51 dex is of course not ideal for a warrior without Estramantis, but with some respecking and plus dex and plus int on my gear, I did make it work. Take reduced critical strike damage is yet another fantastic stat that you can add through soul cores. But you already know there are a ton of options available when it comes to soul cores. Finding the most impactful upgrade for your build is very important. You always want to get the most bang for your buck. Before you decide what you want to upgrade, it is a great idea to find your weakest pieces before spending a ton of currency on something that might only marginally improve your build. Tip 13. I know some of you might be against this tip, but to each their own. The game is in early access, and losing a pinnacle boss to a one-shot or bad visual clutter is the worst. Fortunately, with the most recent patch, some of this visual clutter has been improved, and you should no longer die after killing a boss to some clown rolled on death effect. I have a lot more respect for somebody who plays a build that struggles with some boss fights and perhaps logs out 1 or 2 times to come out victorious than somebody who straight up one-shots the boss and skips all the mechanics altogether. On normal boss fights and when doing regular mapping, you can simply pause the game in a heated situation and decide if you want to take a trip to your hideout or clutch up. During pinnacle boss fights, however, you can't pause the game, but if you press escape and click back to character select quickly, you can actually log out if you find yourself in a bad situation, which is essentially the same type of cheese, just one more step. Just make sure you place a portal right before the boss arena so you don't have to backtrack. Tip 14. You need about 8k EHP, which is your combined total life and energy shield, to be able to tank most hits from pinnacle boss attacks, where some mechanics require even more to survive a hit, namely the Arbiter. Very few builds can actually tank anything that boss throws at them, so rather than trying to build in a way where you might be able to tank a hit, in the current state of the game, it's almost always better to go full smork and build as offensively as you can. It's definitely a cliche in ARPGs, but unfortunately it holds true in Path of Exile too. Even if it's against the whole design philosophy of the game and the vision of the developers. But hey, it's early access, so surely things will change. When your build packs a lot of damage, Life Leech becomes really valuable as a defensive layer. Life regeneration is another amazing stat a lot of players sleep on. Waystone modifiers you almost always want to skip, if you care about your character that is, are reduced regen, elemental penetration, minus max resistance, and elemental weakness if you're not overcapped on resistances. Hopefully GGG finds a way to make building defensively more viable. Armor update when? Tip 15. Instill your Waystones with distilled emotions for more juice. Simulacrum splinters go for half an exalted each, and having delirium on your map can be very lucrative if your build can run it. It does make the monsters a lot more tanky, including map bosses, but it is absolutely worth it to make a juicy map with rarity, quantity and pack size even more juicy. Any distilled emotion works to get simulacrum splinters to drop in your map, on top of adding more delirium monsters. The best emotions to use are distilled paranoia, which adds 45% more rare monsters to your Waystone, distilled greed, which adds 24% rarity of items found in the area, and lastly distilled guilt, which increases the pack size of all monsters by 24%. Which is the one I like to run the most. None of these instilled emotions are expensive and you'll get way more returns from your maps, so it's absolutely worth it. Another tip is to use your Orbs of Alchemy on wide maps to straight up give them 4 modifiers, rather than having to transmute, augment, regal and then exalt. If you want to create some really juicy maps, you can use the Omen of Sinistral Alchemy, which costs 7 exalted orbs. This will make alchemy orbs roll the maximum amount of prefix modifiers on your map, which are the good modifiers, such as increased rarity, quantity, pack size, etc. When you run a map with a delirium node on it, you can put in a non-instilled waystone, otherwise the delirium mirror does not appear. I am not sure whether it's actually better to run instilled Waystones on deadly nodes or not, but I think it is. The direction your character faces when touching the mirror is the direction the fog will move over the course of your map. So if you're familiar with the map layout, you can point it to the right direction to make sure the fog expands efficiently. If you feel like the map is a little bit too much for your build and you would like to stop the delirium encounter, you can do that. Simply click this button in the right bottom corner of your screen. Do note that once you run an instilled Waystone, the delirium in the map will be permanent and unskippable. Tip 16. Do you want to level a new character, but don't want to spend another 50-60 hours slugging your way through the campaign? Do not forget about leveling uniques and leveling builds. There are a bunch of great uniques that you can equip at a very low character level, which will help you speed through the campaign. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to leveling uniques, so I decided it deserves a video of its own. Feel free to check it out. I cover 2 great leveling builds and explain about leveling uniques. All of the leveling uniques covered in that video and the builds can be found in this video's description. Tip number 17. Some more inspiration for a build upgrade is the Against the Darkness Time Lost Jewel. This jewel adds different stats to small passive skills and or notable passive skills within the range of the jewel. Currently I'm using one that gives me increased max life for each small passive skill and plus 1% max fire resistance per notable skill. The power of this jewel is actually insane if you put it in a jewel socket location on your tree where you have a bunch of nodes stacked. As you can see, it gives me a grand total of 16% increased maximum life and plus 4% maximum fire resistance. How's that for a jewel? Another jewel that is really strong is the Megalomaniac Diamond, which adds 2 or even 3 passive tree keystones when socketed. This can be any combination of 2 keystones and is a great way to add things to your build that you would otherwise not be able to reach on the passive tree. Do note that the stronger combination of notable keystones on this jewel, and especially if they have 3, can become very expensive. The third jewel that is useful for most builds is the Controlled Metamorphosis Diamond, which lets you allocate passives surrounding the jewel socket it's socketed in. This jewel has 8 variants with different sizes of rings. The ring determines the range between the jewel and the notable. You can only spec the notable if it's within the ring. If you decide to buy one of these jewels, be absolutely sure you buy one with the correct ring size. I would like to use this jewel on my warrior, but I need some build upgrades to run it, as the best spot on the passive tree for me would be the attributes wheel. But unfortunately I do need all the attributes, since I don't have Esther Mantis yet. A controlled metamorphosis with a medium small ring would allow me to grab Polymathy, Jack of all trades and Send in the Eyes without having to travel to any of these nodes, which is huge. But the power I get from Against the Darkness is decent enough for now. Tip 18. The lesser essences are pretty useless currently, as they only add a single modifier to a white item. It's still more deterministic than using a transmute orb on a white item, but don't expect too much from the lesser essences. Especially if you're solo self-found and you're looking for something specific. Greater essences on the other hand are something you should absolutely not be sleeping on. Did you find a magic item with 2 really good modifiers and you want to increase your odds of crafting a good item? Then you can use a greater essence that adds a modifier type that is the most desirable, rather than just using a regal orb and praying. Well, you still gotta pray, just it's slightly less, I guess. For example, you can have a really good pair of boots with maximum rarity and a high mana roll, and you can use an essence of haste to guarantee a movement speed mod. It can still roll a low tier mod, but at least it's not gonna roll accuracy or light radius. A lot of greater essences are expensive and should only be used on a top tier magic item. But if you're playing solo self-found, essences are the best way to target craft items that suffice your needs. Essences in PoE2 are nowhere near as potent as they are in PoE1, but they can still be very useful. If you are playing on trade, however, you probably just want to sell your greater essences and strong items with open mods, unless you are loaded with currency already. Gambling is still gambling after all, even if it's slightly more deterministic. Tip 19. When you get deeper and deeper into the Path of Exile endgame, you will find yourself starting to get conditioned. You start to wonder if you're still sane.
Still sane, Exile?
Even the divine drop is not what it used to be. In other words, if there's a ton of loot you don't want to pick up because you're suffering from success, it is due time to update your loot filter and make it more strict. Perhaps you want to hide some mid-rare bases, or certain currency drops. Expedition catalysts. Well, you can find my strict endgame loot filter based on the CDR loot filter linked down below. It's extremely simple to configure and make your own adjustments. I encourage you to give that a go. Even with a proper filter, you will still swim in loot sometimes. The loot can bug out a bit, where it makes you walk to the loot every time you try to pick something up. Simply press your button to toggle hide and show loot, which is Z by default on PC, to reorganize it so you can collect it more easily. Sometimes it's also a good idea to press Alt to view the loot without a filter, to get an idea of what is actually dropping for you. And if you do make adjustments to your filter, always test them. Tip number 20. Tiered rares should on average be a lot better than non-tiered rares. The odds of getting the highest tier modifier are way higher on tiered ones. You don't want to hide any of these on your filter, and always make sure to identify and pick them up. Especially since the recent big patch, now that the modifier rolls are fixed. Tiered rares were actually bugged, where, for example, a tier 5 rare bow would not be able to roll attack speed at all. If you're lazy and you don't want to look up every single rare you think could be decent on first glance, utilize a dump tab in your stash, which is a stash tab with a fixed price of about 10 or 20 exalted orbs, where you just dump all your loot after you finish a map. If you get whispered quickly after dumping an item, it is your cue to actually price check it. Tip number 21. Regex is a string of characters you can put in any of the in-game filters to filter out groups of multiple modifiers. You can use the website PoE2.re, which is linked down below in the description, to create a regex. For example, what if I don't want to run any Waystone with elemental weakness, less recovery, and or elemental penetration? Sounds familiar? I can simply select these three options on the website, copy the regex and paste it in my stash to quickly filter for maps that don't or do have all of these modifiers. But what if my build can somehow handle everything and I want to filter for rarity, quantity and pack size instead? Well, you can do this too. Regex is also very useful to quickly check vendors for certain items, filter for tablets with good modifiers, and so much more. The website is currently in development, so some mods might still be missing from the regex. Most map modifiers are already translated, however, minus maximum resistance is not. We still have to manually check for that one. Tip number 22. Buckle up, because this will be a long one. There are a couple rules of thumb you want to follow when trying to set up your atlas to get the most out of your juicy maps. Breach combined with Delirium are currently the best currency farming methods, and nothing really compares to the gains from these two mechanics. It is very important to have 8 out of 8 Breach Atlas nodes, as this massively increases the amount of loot that drops from your maps. Less important, but also very welcome, are 8 out of 8 Delirium nodes. Getting your 8 Breach points should not be that bad. Xest, the Breach boss, is really not that much harder to kill on tier 0 than he is on tier 3. Getting your 8 Delirium points, on the other hand, can be an absolute pain. Sometimes your Simulacrum just breaks if you get a terrible combination of mods in a wave. Simulacrums are a bit overtuned as is, and it was directly ported over from PoE1 to PoE2. If you can only get 2, 4 or 6 points on your Deli tree, that's fine too. For the Breach tree, we want to spec into Crumbling Walls first, as it's by far the best node on the Breach tree, Frantic Invasion and Rising Pyre after, and lastly Grasping Hands for the most overall loot. You can also opt to spec into Sustained Siege if you can't clear breaches fast enough. This really helps. For the Delirium tree, you want to spec into Get Out of My Head first, and Would You Like to See My Face afterwards. This will massively increase the amount of Delirium splinters that drop from your maps. Next, you want to spec into They're Coming to Get You, and finally, It's Not Real, It's Not Real. I freaking love the names of these Delirium nodes. The most important modifiers on your map by far are increased quantity of items found and increased rare monsters. All the other beneficial modifiers are marginal at best in comparison. I made a mistake when I said that pack size is my favorite instill mod on maps. Increased rare monsters is actually a lot better. If you already have 200% increased rarity of items found on your gear, the only modifier on tablets that really matters when it comes to drops is increased quantity of items found. Remember that anything beyond 200% increased rarity has vastly diminishing returns. A second good modifier on tablets would be increased rare monsters in your map. Only run this if you're out of tablets with item quantity modifiers on them. The strat is to stack as many of these tablets as possible. You want to find spots on your atlas that have both tower range overlap and good map layouts. To see the tablet range of a tower, simply hover over the tower to see which maps are in range. The best layouts for Breach plus Delhi are always going to be open maps, such as Oasis, Creek, Steppe, Savannah, Blooming Field, or Steaming Springs. This is because breaches that can expand in all directions spawn a lot more monsters overall than, for example, a breach that spawns in the corner of the map. When you have found a nice spot on your atlas with a ton of good map layouts and tower overlap, it's time to get to work. Try to complete as many bad maps as you can before you complete your towers and put in your tablets, to make sure to target only the good maps with your breach tablets. Once all good map layouts have a breach node on them, it does not matter which type of tablet you use, as long as it has quantity of items found as a modifier on it. When you've completed all of your overlapping towers and stuffed them up with big boy quantity tablets, it's time to collect your things. Oh, level 20 Spirit Gem, what? Hopefully with future Path of Exile 2 updates, other mechanics become viable too, but for now it's best to only do Ritual and Expedition if it's already part of your map. Tip 23. Over the course of blasting maps, most of you will inevitably find yourself sitting on a good old pile of gold, with no major gold sinks in the game, outside of the currency exchange and, of course, gambling. Don't forget to gamble your gold on amulets every now and then. This is by far the best base type to gamble, as the pool of modifiers that can roll on amulets is rather small, and the odds of hitting a good combination of mods is a lot higher than on other item types. Amulets also have a rather low drop chance in general, so the demand for good amulets is higher than other item types you can gamble. If you really hate amulets for some reason, you can also opt in to go for rings. Once you have a full inventory of amulets, you can either check them individually or dump them all in the price tab and see if you get spammed for anything. After gambling away about 2 million of my finest gold pieces, selling all the useless amulets and crafting the decent ones, I ended up with a couple amulets that might actually sell for a div or two. And if you're really lucky, you get an Esther Mantis from gambling, because this is actually possible. And on the topic of getting really lucky, if you are not already loaded with currency, it's a terrible idea to chance your good chance bases. The odds are stacked against you when trying to chase high-end uniques with chance orbs. It's kind of in the name, there is a chance, but is it really worth it? No, it's not worth it, don't do it. Please sell your chance bases and chance orbs, namely the stellar amulets for Esther Mantis and sapphire rings for Dream Fragments. White stellar amulets currently sell for a whopping 140 plus exalted orbs, and they're still going up in price. Yup, the economy is pretty messed up. White sapphire rings sell for 20 plus exalted orbs, and white emerald rings, heavy belts, and azure amulets all sell for a pretty penny if sold in bulk. On the topic of bulk selling, if you don't necessarily need more currency on a quick note, it is a good habit to collect a bunch of an item that is in high demand, to then sell it in bulk for more than you'd get when individually selling the items. You can advertise your bulk sales in the global trade channel. There's also a popular Discord server for PoE trading, but that's kind of a cesspool of toxicity and scammers, so I won't mention the name. If you know, you know, you know. I will do you guys the favor and chance orb this entire stash tab of chance bases once it's filled up. And we're getting pretty close. Tip 24. While progressing in the endgame, you should be dropping way more Waystones than you can actually run, especially if you're also looting tier 11 to 13 Waystones. Instead of going through the struggle of tearing up all of your tier 11 to 13 Waystones into tier 15 Waystones, it's a good idea to sell them for some raw gold. The more modifiers the Waystone has, the higher its sell value. A packed tier 11 plus Waystone with 4 or more modifiers sells for around 10k gold. This can easily add up into millions of gold, which is best spent on gambling amulets. Only sell bad corrupted tier 14 Waystones, because you do want to tear up your tier 14 Waystones into tier 15 Waystones using the reforging bench. Having a big surplus of tier 15 Waystones is a great thing. It means you can be picky with what you run and run juicier maps on average. Another tip is to use the reforging bench to reforge your bad tablets, to get more tablets with that juicy increased item quantity. And if you have any tier 13 13 or 14 Waystone with a great item quantity roll on it, it's better to instill it than run it. Tip 25. Besides crafting, Omens can also assist the player in combat. You might have spotted these two Omens that have been sitting in my inventory throughout the majority of this video. The first being the Omen of Resurgence, which brings the player back to full life in an instant whenever you get to low life, which is 35% life or less. Note that if you get one shot, the Omen of Resurgence will not work. In the case of a one shot, there is the second Omen, the Omen of Amelioration, which is a bit more expensive, currently selling for about 100 Exalted Orbs, but absolutely worth the investment once you get to the higher character levels. This Omen returns 75% of experience lost on death. At character level 95 plus, it takes a really long time to level up, and losing 10% experience is a major setback. Even at lower levels, it is a good idea to always have 1 or 2 Omens of Resurgence activated in your inventory. They only cost 8 Exalted Orbs each and can save you from losing a juicy map that would have easily returned that currency. When double dipping both Omens, it can occur that neither of them work. Unfortunately, I'm not sure when or why this happens. Tip 26. Want to drop more Crisis Fragments from your Citadel bosses? Run Waystones with a high percent of Waystone drop chance on your Citadels. There are certain breakpoints where you're guaranteed to drop 2, 3 or even 4 fragments from a single Citadel boss. With 1000% plus Waystone chance, you'll drop at least 3 fragments. Arbiter fragments are going up in price, with the most expensive one, the Faded Crisis Fragment, selling for over 400 Exalted Orbs. The Faded Crisis Fragments drop from the Copper Citadel, guarded by the Citadel boss Jamanra. On Copper Citadels, you want to put as many tablets with increased quantity of Waystones dropped on surrounding towers. In fact, this is good practice on every Citadel, as the other fragments sell for almost a divine each now. Before running the Citadel, you also want to respec your Atlas to maximize Waystone drop chance. Here's an example of what such a tree would look like. It's nothing complicated though, we simply take all the nodes that increase Waystone drop chance. If you are afraid of bricking your Citadel on a higher boss difficulty, you can also choose to unspec your boss tree. On the topic of Atlas passive trees, this is my regular mapping Atlas tree. Use this tree to maximize your loot overall. And if you really want to min-max your loot, you can respec your tree to grab local knowledge whenever you're running swamp and water biome maps for even more currency drops. Just make sure to spec back out of the node when not running swamp and water biome maps, as it will nerf loot overall on other biomes. The biome of a map shows right under the map name on the atlas. Tip 27. Did you get lucky and found a map with multiple breaches in it? Rather than clearing a breach, then looting, then clearing another breach, and then looting some more, etc., it is a better idea to clear all of your breaches first before looting. It can save you a lot of backtracking. When running the juiciest of maps, you want to clear your breaches as thoroughly as possible. Always focus on trying to kill as many rares as you can. If there are multiple breaches in the map, they usually have some overlap, where the loot drops in the same place. I'm pretty sure you've already done enough backtracking, so if you can minimize that by not going to the same location twice, it is probably a good idea. And if you drop something that tinks, be sure to always loot that immediately. You don't want to die with a mirror on the ground. Tip number 28. Path of Building is an incredible piece of software loved by most exiles across the world. It has a ton of different uses, from theory crafting characters from scratch, to being able to see how your build would perform with a certain upgrade or change, but mostly to see accurate numbers representing your actual DPS and survivability. The in-game tooltips are extremely inaccurate, and they do a horrible job at showing the player the power of their build. Unfortunately, we cannot directly import our characters from the game into Path of Building yet, as GGG still has to launch the API to make this possible for Path of Exile 2. I won't go into the details on how to use Path of Building 2, as that would require an entire video on its own. It is good to know PoB has been released for PoE2, and if you feel like theory crafting builds, this is your go-to tool. The PoE2 download link can be found in the video description. Tip 29. Another fantastic resource is PoE2 DB. In this database you can find all items, all classes and ascendancies, But most importantly, every single modifier that can roll on every item and their weight. The weight of a modifier represents the odds of getting said modifier to roll on a certain item. Factors such as item level and base type determine the weight of the mod, or if it can roll at all. Let me explain the weight system, which is commonly used in video games, namely for drop tables. To make it simple, imagine an item can roll a total of 2 modifiers. The first mod being attack speed with a weight of 1, and the second being light radius with a weight of 9. The total weight of all mods would be 1 plus 9, making it 10. Attack speed would be a 1 in 10 or 10% chance, and light radius would be a 9 in 10 or 90% chance. In other words, the odds of rolling a particular modifier are determined by comparing it against the total weight of all modifiers that can potentially roll. Unfortunately, the weight data is not publicly available yet, but once it does, PoE2 DB is your go-to source for modifier weights. For now, you can use PoE2 DB whenever you want to see what modifiers can roll on a certain base type, or which tiers are the highest that can roll, and which item level they can appear on. Exiled Exchange actually tells you if the modifier on an item is the highest it can be. The best mod will show up as T1 and the second best as T2. I really hope GGG either changes back how tiers work like it does in Path of Exile 1, where tier 1 is the highest a mod can be, but they should at least somehow inform the player that they have the highest tier mod on an item. PoE2 DB offers a lot of information about the game that you can't find anywhere in-game, so I encourage you to check it out. And last but not least, tip number 30. Most players start playing the game with default keybinds and then never look back to improve their keybinds. I am absolutely sure that most of you playing on PC have accidentally fat-fingered M a bunch of times when trying to open the map. Well, let's start there. How about we change that pesky microtransactions hotkey to U instead, and have M be the key to open our map. This is a good start, but I reckon you can find a better layout for your skills too. Personally, I love to have a skill on middle mouse click. I've always had left mouse click as move only, but since PoE2 I started using my main skill on left mouse click and I love it. I'm using shield charge on middle mouse and I would replace this with any other mobility skill on other builds. You can press Ctrl in game and it will show you an additional 5 skill binds, which are bound skill 9 through 13. Useful in case you can't fit all of your skills. If you do play a build that uses that many skills, rather than binding even more keys, it can be a good idea to use double key binds such as Ctrl plus Q, Alt plus Q or Shift plus Q. Tinker around with your key binds and see what works best for you. Another tip for the sweaty tryhards is to bind left click on scroll wheel up and down. Ever wondered how some veterans click their items at light speed? Well, jitter clicking only gets you so far. They use a macro to assist with their clicking. You can achieve this with a tool called X-Mouse Button Control. For even more customizability you can use Auto Hotkey, but the latter doesn't seem to work as seamlessly. To set up X-Mouse Button Control, simply install it and run the software. You want to add a profile by adding your Path of Exile 2 executable and changing scroll wheel up and down to left click. The scroll to left click hotkey will only be active if Path of Exile is running in the background. GGG allows the use of macros as long as every action requires at least one input. Every scroll up and scroll down counts as one input. You do not want to use this if you have an unlocked mouse wheel. This would be against the terms of service. I hope this tip prevents at least one person from developing carpal tunnel. As per usual, a link to X-Mouse Button Control can be found down below in the video description. And that's it for my 30 PoE2 endgame tips. This video ended up being quite a bit longer than I initially planned, but there's just so much to talk about when it comes to PoE. Thank you for watching the entire video, and hopefully you've learned something new or at least got some build inspiration for your Path of Exile 2 characters. I stream almost every day on Twitch, starting around 9 PM Central European time. Feel free to come say hi sometime. Do you have an amazing tip that was missing in this video? Please let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed your stay, consider helping my work get shared by liking and subscribing. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you next time.